Welcome back to the Deep Dives, everyone. Today we're taking a trip back in time and heading to a place that's been in the news a lot lately, but we're going way back, I mean way back, to ancient Gaza.
Yeah, Gaza, it's a region that's often, well, overshadowed by its neighbors, places like Egypt. But it really has its own amazing story to tell, a story that goes back to, well, basically the beginning of civilization as we know it.
When I think of Gaza, I think of conflict. But as I was getting ready for this deep dive, I was really struck by just how much evidence there is of, all this cultural exchange and interconnectedness, even going back thousands of years. It's kind of amazing.
Yeah, I think that's one of the things that makes Gaza so interesting. It wasn't just a battlefield, but it was like this crossroads for civilizations where ideas and goods and even people would like flow back and forth. It created this incredible cultural tapestry.
So let's try to unravel this tapestry. Where do we even begin with a place that has such a long and layered history?
Well, for me, one of the biggest surprises was the discovery of an Egyptian presence in Gaza that dates back to Dynasty Zero.
Dynasty Zero, what is that? That sounds almost mythical.
It does, right? But it's real, I promise. It's a period in Egyptian history. It's like before the unification of Upper and Lower Egypt. It's a time that we don't know a lot about, but we're getting these glimpses of power. And the amazing thing is we're finding evidence of this early Egyptian presence in Gaza at places like Tel es-Sakin.
So we're talking about like a time before the pyramids, before the pharaohs that we all, picture when we think about ancient Egypt. What kind of evidence are we actually talking about here?
We're talking about like the remnants of settlements, things that might have been early Egyptian strongholds, and then there's pottery workshops, shards of pottery with the names of these early Egyptian rulers on them, even Narmer, the king who unified Egypt. It's like finding this lost chapter in a history book, a chapter that pushes back how far Egyptian influence really reached.
That's incredible. It really changes how we think about, early Egyptian expansion, doesn't it? And it makes you think about what else might be out there just waiting to be discovered.
Absolutely. And that's what I love about archaeology, the idea that there's always something new that could completely rewrite history.
Speaking of rewriting history, let's move on to the Bronze Age. This is a period that seems to have really, left its mark on Gaza. We've got these sites like Tel el-Jul, which sounds like something straight out of an Indiana Jones movie.
Oh, for sure. Tel el-Jul was excavated by, get this, Flinders Petrie, a really famous archaeologist, kind of eccentric, but brilliant. And what he found there was really remarkable. Tons of gold, beautiful jewelry, and all this imported pottery, especially from Cyprus. It seems like Tel el-Jul was like this rich and powerful center of trade in the Middle Bronze Age, a place that connected Egypt and the Levant to the rest of the Mediterranean world.
It's like stepping back in time to a world of like ancient luxury and international connections. But there's also a lot of mystery surrounding Tel el-Jul, right?
Yeah, and that's what makes it so fascinating. It's like we have this giant puzzle, but some pieces are missing. We see these huge, elaborate structures, but we're still not totally sure what they were used for. Were they palaces, administrative buildings, temples, maybe a little bit of everything? The evidence is amazing, but not always clear-cut.
Like a puzzle with some pieces missing, but the pieces we have are just stunning. So we've got this wealthy center at Tel el-Jul, but what about other parts of ancient Gaza during the Bronze Age? Were they all equally well off and connected?
Well, let's shift gears a bit and talk about El Maraka. It gives us a bit of a different perspective on Bronze Age Gaza excavations there, found evidence of a Middle Bronze Age settlement, maybe with some administrative stuff going on based on these clay ceilings. But what makes El Maraka really special is what they discovered in the later Bronze Age layers.
Okay, you've got me hooked. What do they find?
They found terracotta cones that had the names of two of Egypt's most powerful rulers stamped on them, Thutmose III and Hatshepsut.
Wait a minute. Those are the pharaohs who really expanded Egypt's empire. What were they doing in Gaza?
Now that's the big question. These cones weren't just everyday objects. They were used to mark, like building projects or special dedications, usually associated with, royal authority. Finding them in El Maraka suggests there was a building there, maybe a temple or an administrative center, that was connected to Egyptian power in some way.
So are we talking about a full-on Egyptian takeover of Gaza during this time?
Not necessarily. It was probably much more complicated than that. These cones could represent a way for Egypt to show its influence or control, maybe through alliances or trade agreements, or even a kind of indirect rule, where they had a lot of sway without directly running things. It reminds us that ancient empires didn't always just use brute force to expand. Sometimes it was about forming strategic partnerships and making sure everyone knew who was in charge.
Like a game of chess. But in the Bronze Age, with each empire making calculated moves to try and gain an advantage. And speaking of strategic moves, let's talk about Deir el-Balah. This site gives us a glimpse into not only the political side of things, but also the cultural exchange that was happening during the Late Bronze Age.
Deir el-Balah is really interesting. It gives us this window into, well, not just the politics, but also the culture of that time. Here we see evidence of what we call an Egyptianizing settlement. It had a pottery workshop and later on a fortified structure, suggesting a continued Egyptian presence.
Egyptianizing settlement. That sounds like there was a lot of cultural blending happening.
Absolutely. And the real treasures at Deir el-Balah are in its cemetery. What archaeologists found there is this amazing mix of Egyptian and local burial practices. It's really fascinating. It really is. We find these clay coffins. Some of them are totally Egyptian in style, and others are more, local. It's like they were taking Egyptian ideas but making them their own.
So it wasn't like one culture just taking over, but more of a fusion of ideas and practices.
Exactly. And it's not just the coffins. The burials also include Egyptian jewelry and other objects alongside pottery that was made locally or imported from other places. It paints this picture of a society that was connected to this larger world, but also very much rooted in its own traditions.
Makes you wonder about the people who were buried there, right? Were they Egyptian officials who were stationed in Gaza, or were they locals who were adopting Egyptian ways to show off their status? Maybe a bit of both.
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? It really highlights how complex the relationship between culture and power was in this region. It wasn't just one culture dominating another. It was much more dynamic, a real mix of influences and adaptations. It's a reminder that even way back then, people were interacting and exchanging ideas, shaping each other's cultures in these really fascinating ways.
It's like globalization, but thousands of years ago. So this idea of cultural fusion is really interesting. But as we move from the Bronze Age to the Iron Age, things seem to get a little quiet, archaeologically speaking. What's happening in Gaza during this period? Does it just fade away?
Not at all. Gaza is still a major player. But this is where archaeology gets tricky. Sometimes the evidence we need is, well, it's just not there. We know the region was still really important strategically, a place that everyone wanted to control.
Well, we're talking prime real estate in the ancient world, a place where continents connect, trade routes meet, and cultures clash.
Yeah.
Doesn't sound very quiet to me.
You're right. This is when the Philistines really come onto the scene. They were these seafaring people who migrated to the southern Levant around the 12th century BCE. They established a powerful presence in Gaza and became a major force in the region.
The Philistines. They're straight out of those epic Bible stories, David and Goliath, Samson and Delilah. What does archaeology actually tell us about them in Gaza specifically?
That's where things get a bit more difficult. While we have lots of evidence of Philistine settlements in other parts of the southern Levant, their presence in Gaza itself is less well documented archaeologically. Some excavations have found Philistine pottery, but we don't have the full picture of their city layouts, their daily lives, or how they interacted with other groups in the area.
So it's like they left a little something behind, but not the whole story. But even with what we do have, we can still get a sense of their impact, right?
Definitely. The Philistines were known for being really skilled at metalworking. They were strong militarily, and they had their own unique culture. We can imagine that they left their mark on Gaza, even if we're still piecing together all the archaeological evidence.
So picture the Iron Age as this big melting pot of cultures and conflicts, with the Philistines adding their own unique flavor to the mix. And it must have been a time of constant change and upheaval.
It was, and Gaza was right in the middle of it all with its strategic location. It was a place where empires collided, trade routes converged, and cultures clashed and blended, creating a society that was always changing and evolving.
Sounds like a real-life historical drama, but with some scenes missing. What happens after the Philistines?
Yeah.
Does Gaza finally fade into the background?
Absolutely not. Gaza's story is far from over. In fact, it continues to be a strategically important place and was conquered and ruled by a whole series of empires. The Assyrians, Babylonians, Persians, even Alexander the Great. Each of these empires left their own mark on the city, adding new layers to its already complex history.
Wow, that's like a who's who of ancient superpowers. Sounds like Gaza was the place to be for empires back then.
Yeah.
But with all these empires coming and going, did Gaza manage to hold on to its own identity? Or did it just get absorbed into these bigger empires?
That's a great question, and the answer, as with most things in history, is complicated. While Gaza was definitely influenced by the cultures of its conquerors, it also held on to its own unique identity. It was a blend of local traditions and outside influences. Imagine it like a chameleon, adapting to its surroundings but always keeping its core essence.
So even under the rule of these powerful empires, Gaza never lost its own cultural flavor, its own way of life.
Yeah.
Like that saying, you can conquer the land, but you can't conquer the spirit.
Exactly. That resilience, the ability to change and evolve without losing its identity, is a big part of what makes Gaza's story so fascinating. It's a story of survival, of transformation, and of the enduring power of place.
And it's a story that continues even today, right? From those ancient empires to the modern world, Gaza has remained a significant place, a place of both conflict and cultural exchange.
Absolutely. Understanding the long history of Gaza, with all its different layers of civilization, is crucial for understanding its complexities today. It reminds us that the past isn't just something that happened a long time ago. It shapes who we are now and who we will be in the future.
Well said. It's like that William Faulkner quote, "The past is never dead. It's not even past." And in Gaza, the past is very much alive, both in the physical remains and in the memories and traditions of its people. It's really incredible how archaeology can make the past feel so real, like we can almost reach through time and connect with those who came before us.
It really is amazing. And in the case of Gaza, these archaeological discoveries, they don't just challenge what we thought we knew about the past, they also make us think about the present in new ways.
I keep thinking back to what we were talking about earlier, about the evidence of all that cultural exchange in ancient Gaza. It's not just the typical story of, conquest in one culture dominating another. It's a lot more complex than that.
You're right. The archaeological record shows this really vibrant mix of influences, how people adapted to different things. It suggests that even in ancient times, people were connected, they were sharing ideas and technologies and cultural practices over huge distances.
It really makes you question some of those simple narratives we see in, like, history books, doesn't it?
Definitely. And that's why it's so important to keep exploring, to keep digging, and to keep putting those pieces of the past together. The more we learn about where we've been, the better we understand where we're going.
So let me ask you this. Why should our listeners care about the ancient history of a place like Gaza? What does it all mean for them today?
Well, I think it's a good reminder that history isn't just a bunch of dates and battles. It's about people, about how they lived and adapted, and how places have this lasting power.
And it's a story that's still being written. As archaeologists keep exploring Gaza, they're finding new things, they're challenging old ideas, and they're showing us these connections that link us to the past and to each other.
Just imagine for a second what it would have been like to live in Gaza back in the Bronze Age, surrounded by all those signs of Egyptian power and influence. Were you impressed? Or did you resent it? Archaeology really makes us think about these questions.
It's like stepping back in time and experiencing history firsthand. Before we wrap things up, I have to ask, what was the one thing from our exploration of ancient Gaza that really surprised you? For me, it was finding out about those early Egyptians being there, back in Dynasty Zero, even before Egypt was unified.
That's definitely a big one. For me, I think it's the complexity of the cultural exchange that we see in the archaeology. It reminds me that the past is full of surprises and that we're always learning new things about history.
It's like we're always peeling back new layers, finding new perspectives, and making new connections. So for our listeners out there, I want to leave you with this thought. What if we could fully excavate ancient Gaza? What stories would we find? What would we learn about the people who lived and traded and fought for control of this place?
That's a great question to think about, isn't it? It reminds us that the search for knowledge never really ends. There's always something more to discover, more to learn, more to share with each other.
So keep exploring, keep asking questions, and keep digging deeper, because the past is full of amazing things waiting to be discovered, and the story of humanity is far from over. If you enjoyed our deep dive into ancient Gaza, be sure to subscribe to the deep dive so you don't miss out on our next adventure. Until then, keep those minds curious.